Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. In a lot of my HeroQuest videos, I talk about the differences between the European and the North American versions of the game. I thought I would finally try to put all of that information in a single video for convenience. The problem is, it's not an easy thing to do. Yes, the European versions and American versions are different, but that's only part of the story. The first European edition is different to the second European edition, as the second edition had extra equipment cards, a revised rules book, and changed the first mission from the maze to the trial. And then there was the HeroQuest Advanced Quest edition, which was different again and was called HeroQuest Master Edition in some territories. Then some rules for the European edition changed slightly when the HeroQuest Adventure Design Kit came out, as there was a move away from using equipment cards as finite resources and instead writing what equipment you had on your character sheet. And then of course Hasbro republished HeroQuest in 2021, and they changed some stuff from the original North American version of the game. They introduced the equipment cards from the European version, and I believe they added some extra equipment too, and of course they had to remove all elements relating to Games Workshop's IP. Hence, we now have abominations instead of femurs. And it goes without saying, the differences extend to the expansions too. The European versions of Keller's Keep and Return of the Witchlord are very different to the American ones, and Against the Ogre Horde and Wizards of Morcar never got American releases at all, while Europeans were denied access to the American expansions Frozen Horror and Mage of the Mirror. So it's all a bit of a mess to untangle, and to a certain extent the differences will depend on which editions you are looking at. For the sake of this video, I will try to be as comprehensive as possible, but I'm going to focus mainly on changes in rules because that's the big stuff. Taking a step back to review the two versions as a whole before drilling into specifics, the most obvious difference is the way in which the two rule sets suggest you should play. For the Euro edition, there is definitely more of a focus on the heroes being in competition with each other. It's easier to survive the dungeon exploring by yourself, and there are several rules that encourage you to screw over your friends, like being able to cast spells on them. It's more of a race to find loot, and it opens up opportunities for negotiation. Yes, okay, I'll cast a healing spell on you, but only if you give me that staff you found. Conversely, the American rules set creates a much more dangerous environment where heroes require a lot more cooperation to survive. Items are generally more expensive and loot harder to find, so there's more need to pool resources to buy the things you need. The sum result is you get two games that may look the same, but they're actually quite different. As soon as you start selecting characters, differences become apparent. In the US version, heroes are allocated starting equipment, the weapons they will use to fight, and the benefits from those items are incorporated into their stat profiles. In the Euro version, there is no indication that the heroes start with specific items. Their stats are their innate strengths. At first blush, the sum total is the same, but this does have an impact should heroes lose their equipment. In the US version, a hero fighting without any weapons rolls 1 dice to attack and 2 dice to defend. In the Euro version, a hero fighting without a weapon just uses the stat profile on the hero card, which means the unarmed barbarian is still rolling 3 dice. While it should be noted that the stats for the heroes are the same across both editions, the mind stat is almost irrelevant in the Euro edition, at least as far as the core game is concerned. One of the main purposes of the mind stat is to resist magic, and in the US edition Zargon has access to certain chaos spells that named villains can use when they're in play. These spells may require a test against the mind value to determine success. For example, the Fear spell requires a hero to roll 1 red dice for each mind point, and the spell is cancelled if the hero rolls at least 1 6. Morcar, the Euro version of Zargon, because several villains and NPCs were given different names, doesn't have access to spells in the same way, as there is no deck of chaos spells. As an interesting aside, only one core game mission in the Euro edition has a wizard that casts spells at all. It's the mission called the Fire Mage, and to get around the lack of enemy spells, the evil Fire Mage just takes the set of 3 fire spells off the heroes, meaning the heroes don't have access to any fire magic for that scenario. Naturally, in the US version of the mission, the Fire Mage gets his own spells and is simply immune to the fire spells that the heroes use. Anyway, so unnecessary is the mind points value in the Euro version of the game, there is even a special note in the rules book stating, mind points are not used in the initial quests, they will become more important in future expansions. Indeed, mind points do eventually become more useful in the expansions, but not to the degree they are in the US edition. In fact, the only real use for them is if one of your spellcasting buddies decides to be a tool and cast a sleep spell on you, which is another point to mention. As I said before, the European edition does lean into a bit of friendly competition, and all the spells are worded so you can zap your mates. The wizard can happily put the barbarian to sleep in order to step over him and get to a treasure first, for example. He can even outright kill his friends with a well-timed Fire of Wrath spell if he really wants to, but it's not recommended because bad things will happen to the wizard afterwards. Conversely, the offensive US spell cards are worded so that they can only target monsters. You have to play fair. There are actually other differences between the spells in each edition too. All the US spells require that you roll regular d6 to defend against them, usually looking for a 6, while the Euro spell cards ask you to roll shields for defense. This actually makes the spells less effective on heroes as they have a higher chance of deflecting them. Spells are often weaker in the US version too. For the Ball of Flame spell, the monsters can block damage on a roll of a 5 or a 6, while in the Euro edition they have to roll their black shield, and the US Stone Skin spell only buffs defense by 1 dice rather than 2. But I think that's enough about spells, let's move on to talk about movement. Not much to say here other than in the Euro edition a hero can only pass through another hero's space with permission. This allows heroes to block routes, standing indoors to prevent other heroes getting to treasure first. Part of that friendly competition thing. Another interesting thing to note is that the European missions generally have different layouts to the US counterparts. Doors are often in slightly different positions, there may be more or less furniture in the rooms, and the amount of loot you find in treasure chests is usually different too. You tend to get a lot less coins in the US version. Most importantly, there are generally a lot less monsters to fight in the European dungeons, again playing into that idea of being a game where you can wander off alone if you want to, because the risks aren't as severe. As a quick comparison, the Rescue of Sir Ragnar mission has 5 goblins, 7 orcs and 1 femur in the Euro version. The US version has 10 goblins, 10 orcs and an abomination. Fighting is much more of a thing. I must say, I do think this idea of HeroQuest as a more competitive type of game was somewhat diluted by the second edition. When the game first came out, the original mission was the maze, which had all 4 heroes separated and racing to get out of a maze first. It set the tone as a kind of go-it-alone race. When the second edition came out, the mission was changed to the Trial, which was the first mission from the US version, and that mission is incredibly tough and encourages more teamwork. I also don't want to over-egg the significance of being able to stitch up your fellow heroes. There was no obligation for people to play that way, many people wouldn't have played that way, and as much as anything else, the design choices in the European version really just made it a more easygoing family game suitable for really young players. But while we are talking about map layouts and monsters, it seems a good point to bring up one of the most obvious differences and the one that most people know about: body points for monsters. In the European version, every monster has a single body point, even the bosses. Personally, I feel this is a good fit if you are playing the game in a competitive way, running off on your own and racing for treasure. The monsters become more like speed bumps, and because they don't arrive in such large numbers, you actually can split the party without risk of a lone hero getting absolutely murdered. There is still risk. The wizard wandering into a room with 4 orcs is going to have a bad time, but the risks are mitigated, and the challenge isn't killing the bosses, it's getting to the bosses first. But for the US rules set, making the monsters tougher and more plentiful certainly feels like the right choice. Oh, and for inquiring minds who need to know, the goblins, orcs and skeletons are the same in both editions. Abominations and mummies have 2 body points instead of 1. The zombies get 1 extra point of movement, taking their movement total to 5. The Dread Warriors get an extra movement point for a total of 7, an extra attack dice for a total of 4 and 3 body points, and the Gargoyle gets an extra defense dice for a total of 5 and 3 body points as well. Named villains also have different stats, but I'm not going to list all of those because of spoilers. Another difference in the rules that can make it harder to deal with monsters in the US edition relates to line of sight. In the Euro edition, if you are in a room, you can see everything in that room. If you are in a different room or a corridor, then you can see anything that you can draw an unobstructed line to from any part of your character's square. In the US version, you have to be able to draw an unobstructed line from the centre of your square to the centre of the target square, regardless of where you are. This makes positioning in rooms much more critical and prevents the wizard from casting spells from behind a meat shield. Anyway, while the body point rules is probably the most immediately apparent rules change, there are 4 other rules changes that really impact how the game plays: traps, treasure, searching, and death. As the only certainties in life are death and taxes, let's talk about those first. Death is easy enough. In the European version, if you die, you die. That's it. You reach 0 body points and you are instantly removed from play. In the US version, if you are reduced to 0 body points, you have one last chance to drink a healing potion or cast a healing spell on yourself. Only if you can't do that are you finally removed from the game. For treasure items you pull from the treasure deck, basically potions, the big difference is that in the US version you get to keep them between missions. In the European version, any treasure cards you collect but don't use are returned to the treasure deck before the next adventure. That means the healing potion or heroic brew you found is only good for the current quest, and at the start of your next quest, your heroes will only have any equipment, artifacts or gold they have accumulated. So, there's less progression for your heroes, as you simply don't get to amass a lot of different items, but that does make it easier to pick quests at random to play as one-shots. As an aside, I should also note that originally equipment cards were a finite resource in the Euro edition. Once the cards were purchased by players, they were no longer available in the shop. This could create situations where a hero could buy all the stuff that's exclusive for the wizard and then hold them to ransom, forcing the wizard to pay inflated prices. This changed when the adventure kit came out, as you just had to note equipment on your character sheet. The new Hasbro edition uses a hybrid of the two systems, as you still get equipment cards, but they are just to serve as reminders and there is no limit on how many you can buy. The composition of the treasure decks is also different. I won't go through everything, but in the Euro deck there were 5 wandering monsters and 3 different traps. In the US deck there were 6 wandering monsters and 4 traps. Furthermore, the Euro deck included 6 different types of treasure items, 5 potions and a holy water, while the US deck only includes 4 different types of potions. And still on the subject of treasure, searching is different in the 2 editions too. For a start, in the Euro edition you are allowed to search for treasure in corridors, which isn't allowed in the US edition, but also there's no limit to how many times you search. In the US edition, each hero can only search each room once for treasure, although they also have the option to search any pit traps they fall down, which is expressly forbidden in the Euro rules. Searching for traps is also different. In the Euro edition, when you search for traps, you also uncover any secret doors. In the US version, you have to search for traps and doors separately. Personally, I prefer rolling these 2 searches together. I don't really see the point in forcing the heroes to make even more searches than they already will. Oh, and any secret doors you do find in the Euro edition are considered open as soon as you find them, but in the US version they are considered closed and you have to open them like any regular door. When you uncover traps from a search, there is also a big difference. The way they are handled in the European version is, frankly, a hot mess. When you search for traps, any spear traps in the corridor or room are immediately deactivated. Next, any pit traps or falling block traps are placed on the board as if they had been activated. From now on, the dwarf or a hero with a toolkit can move adjacent to any token and attempt to disarm it. The dwarf is automatically successful and just removes the token from the board. If you are using the toolkit, you have a 50% chance of losing a body point, and then the token is removed. In the US edition, there's a lot more to it. First, if you search for traps, Zargon, just points out any spaces where traps are present. No tokens are placed on the board, and if you forget where the traps were later on, that's just tough. If you want to try to disarm them, you need a toolkit, unless you're the dwarf obviously, and you have to actually move into the dangerous space. You then roll a combat dice. If you are using a toolkit, the trap goes off if you roll a skull, while if you are the dwarf, it only goes off if you roll a black shield. If the trap does go off, it works as if you had sprung it any other way and you put the trap token on the board if applicable. Once the trap token has been placed, you can no longer disarm it or remove it from play. It becomes a permanent feature of the dungeon. That means a falling block trap can potentially close off areas of the map, which is something that can't happen in the Euro edition as long as you have a dwarf or a toolkit handy. Phew, that's a lot of stuff. And I'm probably still missing things. I haven't even touched on component differences such as card sizes or token designs. But I think at this point you get the idea. These 2 editions may have the same name and the same quests, but they are very different in play. Clearly, the US version is more complicated. It's not complicated, just more complicated, and has a bit more finesse in how things like traps and treasure are handled. That version also makes use of mind points, which I think is a big oversight in the version I grew up playing, as they give the wizard one of the biggest strengths and the barbarian his biggest weakness. Meanwhile, the Euro version is very simple and streamlined and plays much quicker, perfect for introducing to even the youngest gamers, with a bit of a nasty streak that can make it an absolute hoot if you play competitively with friends. Obviously, the European rule set is the version I know and love. It's wrapped in nostalgia and it's the perfect rule set for playing with my kids, but I do think the US version is the more complete, robust and generally better one. If I was going to pick up HeroQuest for the first time ever today, that's the rule set I would want to use. But I think I'm about done here. I'm going to sign off, edit this video together, upload it, and immediately kick myself as I realise a major difference I completely forgot to mention. I'm sure you will let me know about it in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider pressing the like button. If you really enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so, and hopefully I'll see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.